Welcome to Story Planet, a place where stories unfold gently, like the turning of autumn leaves or the soft ripple of a quiet stream. Here, time slows, love lingers, and second chances bloom in unexpected places. Step into the Lavender Cottage, where the air carries the scent of lavender and memories, where the past whispers its secrets, and where home is more than just a place, it's a feeling. Let yourself wander through Honeywick, a village filled with warmth, golden sunsets, and the comforting embrace of new beginnings. Take a breath, close your eyes, and let the story carry you home. The train chugged softly through the rolling English countryside, its rhythmic hum lulling Claire Hastings into a quiet reverie. She sat by the window, watching the fields stretch far and wide, a gentle patchwork of green and gold swaying under the warm embrace of the late afternoon sun. Tiny cottages, each with its own character, dotted the landscape like well-kept secrets of time. Some had thatched roofs, others stood tall with ivy clinging lovingly to their stone walls. It had been years since she had last been on a journey like this, one that led not to an obligation, but to the unknown promise of something new. At 70 years old, Claire was no stranger to change. She had experienced the slow unfolding of life, the joys and the sorrows, the hellos and the goodbyes. For 45 years, she had built a life with Arthur, her husband, her anchor. They had raised children, built a home, laughed over morning coffee, and sat hand in hand through the quiet, golden years of retirement. But then, time had carried him away like a leaf drifting on an autumn wind, leaving Claire with a house full of memories and the deafening silence of absence. And so, she had done what she never thought she would. She had let go. She had packed up a lifetime, keeping the little things that mattered most, and sold the house that had once been their haven. Not because she wanted to forget, but because she needed to keep moving, to find a new rhythm, a gentler way to exist without feeling like a shadow in her own life. The train slowed, and an old-fashioned sign swung into view. Honeywick. The very name felt warm on her tongue, like the taste of honey stirred into tea. A small village, barely a dot on the map, but full of charm. It was here that she would begin again, in the cottage she had only seen in photographs, a little place surrounded by lavender fields that whispered in the breeze. Claire stepped off the train with a deep breath, the air carrying the scent of earth after a morning rain. The station was quaint, one of those rare places that time had been kind to. The wooden bench beneath the large oak tree was worn but sturdy, and the sign above the ticket booth still had hand-painted letters. A few villagers milled about, some greeting each other with the ease of old familiarity. She adjusted her coat and took a moment to steady herself. This was it, a new beginning. "Mrs. Hastings, I presume?" Claire turned to see a young woman with wild auburn curls standing nearby, holding a clipboard and wearing an eager smile. "Yes, that's me," Claire replied warmly. "I'm Sophie Fletcher from Honeywick Realty. Welcome to Honeywick. We spoke on the phone about the purchase of the Lavender Cottage. Let me help you with your bags." Claire handed over her smallest suitcase, grateful for the assistance. Sophie led her to a charming little car parked just outside the station, its pale blue paint slightly faded but still holding on to its vintage charm. "It's a lovely drive to your new home," Sophie said as they set off down the winding road. "Honeywick isn't very big, but I think you'll find it has everything you need. There's a bakery, a bookshop, a little cafe, and plenty of friendly faces." Claire smiled, absorbing the sights. The village unfolded before her like a storybook. Cobblestone paths lined with flowers, stone cottages with white shutters, and a gentle stream meandering through the heart of it all. Children played near the village green, and a few elderly gentlemen sat on a bench outside the cafe, engaged in a leisurely game of chess. As they passed the bookshop, Sophie pointed enthusiastically. "That's Finch and Fable, the sisters who run it, Mabel and Edith, have lived here all their lives. They know everyone and everything about this village." Claire chuckled. "That sounds both wonderful and slightly intimidating." Sophie grinned. "Oh, they're harmless. Mostly. If you enjoy reading, you'll love it there." They continued along the narrow road, and soon a familiar sight came into view. A small stone cottage nestled amid rolling fields of lavender. Its slate roof was weathered but charming, the windows framed with delicate white trim. A wooden gate, slightly askew, marked the entrance, and a winding pathway led up to the front door, where an old brass knocker in the shape of an owl waited. Sophie pulled to a stop. "Here we are, the Lavender Cottage." Claire stepped out, her breath catching slightly as she took it all in. The scent of lavender was immediate, soft and calming, carried on the afternoon breeze. It curled around her like a welcome embrace. She approached the gate slowly, running her fingers along the aged wood before pushing it open. The garden had seen better days. Wild roses climbed freely along the fence, and ivy had begun to creep towards the windows. But it was beautiful in its own untamed way, full of life and promise. Sophie handed her the keys with a warm smile. "It's all yours. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. The village is always happy to help new residents settle in." Claire took the keys, the cool metal pressing into her palm, like a tangible reminder that this was real. This was home now. As she stepped inside, the air held the faint scent of old books and lavender, a combination that felt strangely comforting. The wooden floors creaked gently beneath her feet, and the soft light filtering through the lace curtains gave the space a golden glow. She placed her suitcase down, exhaling slowly. The silence here was different. It wasn't the lonely hush of an empty house, but the kind of quiet that came with peace. Claire walked to the window, looking out at the lavender fields swaying in the distance. The past would always be a part of her, but standing here, in this moment, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something beautiful. The first night in the Lavender Cottage was one of quiet reflection. Claire had curled up in an old armchair by the fireplace, a warm cup of chamomile tea cradled between her hands. The cottage, though dusty and in need of a little love, had a warmth to it that she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the grand home she had once shared with Arthur, but that was precisely what she liked about it. It felt like a place where time slowed, where memories could be made in the gentle hush of country life. She slept soundly, the scent of lavender drifting through the slightly open window. And when morning came, she woke with a lightness in her chest that had been absent for months. After a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, Claire decided to begin the long task of sorting through the cottage's many nooks and crannies. It was clear that the previous owner had left behind more than just furniture. There were small remnants of a life once lived here. The bookshelves were still lined with hardcovers whose pages had yellowed with age. A rocking chair sat by the window as if waiting for someone to return, and the kitchen cabinets held delicate porcelain cups, each with a different floral pattern. Her heart swelled at the thought that someone had once loved this place as much as she hoped to. She made her way upstairs, pausing at the landing to take in the quiet beauty of the cottage. A single hallway stretched ahead, leading to a few modest rooms. The guest bedroom was bare, save for an old wooden bed frame and a dusty vanity. The study next to it contained an antique writing desk, a few framed sketches of lavender fields, and a small oil lamp that had long since run dry. Finally, she reached the attic door. It was a narrow thing, painted white, with an old brass handle that had dulled over time. Something about it called to her. With a firm grip, Claire twisted the handle and pulled. The door let out a soft creak, and a cool, musty breeze greeted her as she stepped inside. The attic was small but filled with forgotten things, old trunks stacked upon one another, wooden crates brimming with linens, and stacks of books that had long since collected dust. A single window let in a stream of morning light, illuminating specks of dust that swirled lazily in the air. Claire ran her fingers along the spine of a book resting on top of one of the trunks. Wuthering Heights, a classic. She smiled, brushing off the dust before setting it aside. Then something caught her eye. At the far end of the attic, tucked away beneath a lace-covered table, was a small, unassuming wooden chest. Unlike the other items around it, this one was different. Carefully placed, as if waiting for someone to find it. Curiosity sparked in her chest. She knelt before it, brushing away the cobwebs before attempting to lift the lid. It didn't budge at first, but after a gentle push, the rusted latch gave way, and the lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped carefully in a piece of faded silk, was a leather-bound journal. Claire's breath hitched. She lifted it gingerly, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The cover was soft with age, and as she traced her fingers along the edges, she noticed a name elegantly etched in faded gold lettering. Eleanor Hartwood. She ran the name through her mind, wondering who she might have been. A previous owner, perhaps? Or someone who had simply left a part of themselves behind. With careful fingers, she opened the journal, revealing page after page of elegant handwriting. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still legible, flowing like poetry across the aged paper. The first entry was dated June 12, 1947. Claire's heart quickened. This journal was over 70 years old. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines. Today, the fields bloomed in their fullest. The lavender swayed like waves upon the sea, whispering secrets in the wind. And I, ever the dreamer, wonder if love will come for me the way it comes in stories. Claire swallowed, the words pulling at something deep within her. She turned the page. There is a man, though I dare not say his name yet, who looks at me in a way that sets my heart alight. But secrets are best kept in ink until they are meant to be spoken aloud. A soft smile graced Claire's lips. This wasn't just a journal. This was a window into a life once lived, a heart once filled with longing, with hope. She traced the name Eleanor Hartwood once more, feeling as though, in some way, fate had placed this journal in her hands for a reason. Standing in the quiet hush of the attic, Claire knew one thing for certain. She would read every word. Claire sat in the cozy embrace of her reading nook, the journal resting delicately in her hands. The soft glow of the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting golden patterns along the wooden floorboards. Outside, the lavender fields swayed with the wind, their gentle rustling a comforting sound that accompanied her quiet solitude. It had been years since she had been so enraptured by a book, but this was different. Eleanor Hartwood's words carried the weight of time, each stroke of ink a whisper from the past, a fragment of a life once lived within these very walls. She traced the elegant script with her fingertips before turning the page. June 18th, 1947. The morning sun spills over the hills like warm honey. I watched the light chase the shadows across the fields today, and I thought to myself, what a lovely way to fall in love with the world again. And then there was him, Thomas Whitmore. Claire inhaled sharply at the name. Whitmore. A name she had heard just yesterday. Daniel Whitmore, the quiet but kind gardener who had helped her carry her luggage up the front steps. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there a deeper thread connecting the past to the present? She continued reading, drawn into Eleanor's world. He is unlike any man I have ever known. There is something in his gaze, a depth that tells me he has seen both the harshest of winters and the sweetest of summers. He works with his hands, shaping the land, tending to the wild beauty of the world. And when he looks at me, I feel as though I, too, am something worth tending to. Claire paused, the words settling over her like a gentle snowfall. Eleanor had been in love. Deeply, beautifully, achingly in love. But why had her story remained tucked away in the attic, forgotten with time? She turned the page, eager to learn more, but the next few entries were filled with daily musings, descriptions of the changing seasons, of the lavender harvest, of warm cups of tea enjoyed by the fireplace. Though lovely, they left Claire yearning for more. Setting the journal aside for a moment, she stood and stretched, her back giving a soft protest at the movement. She had been sitting for far too long, utterly consumed by Eleanor's words. Stepping into the kitchen, she put on the kettle, allowing the familiar ritual of making tea to ground her. As the water warmed, she stared out the window, her eyes landing on the old oak tree at the edge of the property. It stood tall and unwavering, its thick branches stretching toward the sky, its roots buried deep in the earth. There was something about it, something significant. Eleanor had written about it. The oak tree at the edge of the fields keeps my secrets well. Beneath its strong, weathered limbs, I have whispered my hopes, my dreams, and now, my love. A thought struck Claire then. If Eleanor and Thomas had shared something special beneath that tree, could there be something still waiting to be found? Her tea momentarily forgotten, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The afternoon air was crisp but pleasant, the scent of lavender wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. As she approached the oak tree, she ran her fingers along its textured bark, feeling the roughness beneath her touch. Could this be where Eleanor and Thomas had once met in secret? Had they whispered to each other beneath these very branches, stolen moments of love before the world could interfere? She glanced down at the base of the tree, her heart quickening. Something was there. Half buried beneath a thin layer of soil and fallen leaves lay a small, weathered tin box. Claire's breath hitched. Carefully, she knelt, brushing away the dirt before lifting the box into her hands. The metal was cool against her fingertips, rusted in places, but still sturdy. With a trembling hand, she pried it open. Inside, nestled carefully within the confines of time, was an old envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Her pulse quickened. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the name written across the front in delicate cursive. Eleanor Hartwood. A letter that had never been opened. Claire sat back on her heels, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. Why had it been left here, unread, untouched by time? Had Eleanor never found it? Had Thomas written words that had never reached the one they were meant for? 1,000 questions swirled in her mind, but only one thing was certain. She had to know what it said. With the utmost care, she turned the envelope over, slipping a finger beneath the aged flap and slowly pulling it open. The parchment inside was delicate but intact, its folds crisp despite the passing of decades. Taking a steadying breath, she unfolded the letter and began to read. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I have found the courage to put into words what my heart has long carried in silence. I have loved you from the moment our eyes met across the lavender fields. But fate is a cruel thing, and life has pulled me in a direction I never wished to go. I leave tomorrow, not by choice, but by duty. I wish I could promise you that I will return. But the world is uncertain, and my heart aches at the thought of leaving you behind. I need you to know, if ever the stars align and fate allows, I will find my way back to you. Yours always, Thomas. Claire exhaled, a lump forming in her throat. The letter spoke of longing, of unfinished love, of a promise left unfulfilled. And yet, Eleanor had never read it. Her fingers curled around the parchment, the weight of the past settling over her. What had happened to Thomas? Had he returned? Or had Eleanor spent her days waiting for a love that never came home? Claire stared at the letter, a decision forming in her mind. She had to find out. Claire sat at her small wooden kitchen table, the letter from Thomas resting before her like a delicate artifact from another time. The words haunted her, not in a dreadful way, but in the way that old, unfinished stories tend to linger, whispering of paths that were never taken. She traced the edges of the letter thoughtfully. Eleanor had never read it. That much was clear. But why? Had it been misplaced, hidden away by accident? Or had she known it was there all along and chosen not to open it? Claire sighed, rubbing her temples as she reached for her now cold cup of tea. It wasn't her mystery to solve. Not really. And yet, something inside her ached to understand, to know whether Eleanor's story had a happy ending, or if she had spent her days longing for a love that never returned. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. The morning mist curled lazily over the fields, and a distant church bell chimed, marking the new day. Claire pushed back her chair and stood, stretching as she resolved to let the questions rest for a while. Today, she would step outside the quiet walls of the Lavender Cottage and begin acquainting herself with Honeywick. She pulled on a light coat, slipped the letter carefully back into the tin, and tucked it away in the desk drawer. There would be time to unravel the past. But first, she needed to settle into her present. The cobbled streets of Honeywick had an undeniable charm, each corner revealing another piece of the village's gentle, unhurried way of life. The bookshop, Finch and Fable, sat in the heart of the square, its windows lined with neatly stacked novels and handwritten notes tucked between the covers with recommendations from the owners. Claire paused, admiring the way the morning light softened the shop's already cozy appearance. The door swung open with the chime of a small brass bell, and the scent of paper and ink washed over her like an old friend. Oh, my goodness, a new face! Claire turned to find a plump woman with short silver curls and a delighted expression bustling toward her. "You must be Mrs. Hastings. I heard you moved into the Lavender Cottage," the woman said, clasping Claire's hands warmly. "I'm Edith Finch, and my sister Mabel is around here somewhere." Before Claire could respond, a second woman, nearly identical to the first but with a more serious expression, emerged from behind a tall bookshelf. "I'm Mabel Finch," she said, adjusting her spectacles as she gave Claire an appraising look. "Welcome to Honeywick. I hope you don't mind a bit of gossip, because you're sure to be the talk of the village for at least a week." Claire laughed, charmed by their opposing energies. "I suppose there are worse things." "Oh, certainly," Edith agreed, her blue eyes twinkling. "Now, are you a novel reader? Or perhaps a lover of history?" "Both," Claire admitted, "though lately I found myself particularly interested in local history." At that, Mabel's eyebrows lifted. "Is that so? You might find the town's archives interesting. We have records going back nearly 200 years. Claire hesitated, debating whether to mention Eleanor's journal and the letter she had discovered. Would it be strange to bring up a decades-old love story to two women she had just met? Before she could decide, the door swung open again, letting in a burst of fresh morning air. "Well, if it isn't our local recluse," Mabel remarked dryly. Claire turned just in time to see Daniel Whitmore step inside, his tall frame filling the doorway. He carried with him the scent of damp earth and lavender, his hands speckled with soil, as if he had been working in the field since dawn. He gave Mabel a look that was equal parts exasperation and amusement before turning his gaze to Claire. "Good morning, Mrs. Hastings." "Claire, please," she corrected with a smile. His lips twitched in what might have been the beginnings of a smile, though he seemed the sort who rarely indulged in such expressions. "Settling in well?" "I am, thank you. The cottage is lovely. A bit of work to be done, but I rather like that." Daniel nodded, shifting his weight slightly, as if conversation wasn't his strong suit. "If you need any help with the garden, let me know." Mabel gave an exaggerated sigh. "That's about as much conversation as you'll get out of him. A man of the soil, not of words." Daniel shot her a patient look. "I prefer to let the work speak for itself." Claire chuckled. "I appreciate that. Actually," she hesitated, then decided there was no harm in asking. "I came across a name recently, Thomas Whitmore. Was he a relative of yours? Daniel's entire posture shifted. It was subtle, but Claire saw the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way his expression darkened just enough to make her regret asking. He was my grandfather, Daniel said after a pause. Claire's breath caught. Thomas. Eleanor's Thomas. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But before she could ask more, Daniel's jaw tightened and he glanced toward the door. I should be getting back to work. With that, he nodded politely and strode out of the shop, leaving behind the scent of lavender and 100 more questions in Claire's mind. Later that afternoon, as Claire made her way back to the Lavender Cottage, her thoughts swirled like autumn leaves caught in the wind. Thomas Whitmore had been Daniel's grandfather. Did that mean he had returned to Honeywick after all? Or had he never found his way back to Eleanor? And if Daniel knew the name, knew the history, then what did that mean for the letter Eleanor never read? Claire paused at the gate of her cottage, staring out at the lavender fields as they stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Something told her that her move to Honeywick had been more than just coincidence. She had found the Lavender Cottage for a reason, and she was going to uncover the rest of the story. Claire awoke to the soft patter of rain against the window pane. The morning light, muted by the gray clouds, cast a gentle glow inside the Lavender Cottage, making it feel even cozier than usual. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, savoring the stillness, the way the world outside seemed to slow whenever it rained. But her mind was far from quiet. It had been turning restlessly ever since her conversation with Daniel Whitmore the previous day. Thomas Whitmore was his grandfather. The realization sat heavy in her chest, a revelation that felt like a thread waiting to be unraveled. Had Thomas returned to Honeywick? Had he ever reunited with Eleanor? Or had she spent her life waiting for a man who never came back? Claire sighed and pushed the blanket aside. There was only one way to find out. She made her way downstairs, the wooden floor cool beneath her bare feet. The letter from Thomas still rested inside the desk drawer, a quiet invitation to continue Eleanor's story. But today, she wouldn't spend her time inside reading about the past. She would go looking for it. By mid-morning, the rain had eased into a fine mist, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and lavender. Dressed in a warm cardigan and sturdy boots, Claire stepped outside and walked toward the old oak tree where she had discovered the hidden letter. Something about that place lingered in her mind. Eleanor had written about it in her journal. The oak tree at the edge of the fields keeps my secrets well. Beneath its strong, weathered limbs, I have whispered my hopes, my dreams, and now my love. If she and Thomas had met there, could there be more? More letters, more traces of their story waiting to be found? Claire reached the tree and placed a hand on its rough bark. It had stood here for decades, witnessing the quiet unfolding of countless days, the laughter and whispers of those who had come before her. She crouched down near the roots, brushing away damp leaves and loose earth. And then, there it was, another tin box smaller than the first, tucked carefully beneath the twisted roots. It was rusted at the edges, its lid barely holding together, but it was unmistakably there, hidden, forgotten, waiting. Claire's breath caught as she lifted it into her lap. With trembling fingers, she pried it open. Inside, carefully folded and tied with a faded blue ribbon, were several letters, all addressed to Eleanor. Claire's heart pounded as she lifted the topmost one and unfolded the delicate parchment. The ink had faded slightly, but Thomas's handwriting was still legible, the letters looping gracefully across the page. My dearest Eleanor, the days grow colder, and still I think of you. The fields are bare now, the lavender no longer in bloom. Yet in my mind, I see you there, standing among the flowers, sunlight in your hair. I wish I could write you without hesitation, without secrecy. But life has not given me that choice. My father insists I leave for London by week's end. He believes there is no future for me here in Honeywick, tending fields when there are greater fortunes to be made elsewhere. He does not understand that my fortune is here with you. But I cannot disobey him, not yet. Not when my departure is the only way to prove that I am worthy of choosing my own path. I go, but not forever. I swear it to you, Eleanor. I will return. Wait for me, always, Thomas. Claire exhaled, emotion swelling in her chest. He had loved her. He had not left by choice. She reached for another letter, carefully unfolding it. My Eleanor, it has been months since I left Honeywick, and still my heart remains there with you. The city is loud and unkind, and I long for the quiet whisper of the lavender fields, for the evenings spent beneath our oak tree. Tell me you still wait for me. Tell me your heart is still mine, as mine is still yours. Claire's fingers trembled as she lifted yet another letter, this one slightly crumpled, as though it had been carried, perhaps even delivered, but never read. Eleanor, I am coming home. By the time you read this, I will be on the train back to Honeywick. I have done what was asked of me. I have proven my worth. And now at last I return. To you, to our home, to the life we were meant to build together. Wait for me at the lavender fields. T. Claire's chest ached. He had come back. So why had Eleanor never read this letter? Had it never reached her? Or had she moved on before Thomas could return? Claire's mind raced with possibilities, each one filling her with more questions than answers. She carefully tucked the letters back into the tin, knowing that she had uncovered something deeply personal, something that had waited decades to be found. As she made her way back to the cottage, she knew there was only one person in Honeywick who might have the answers she sought. Daniel Whitmore, the grandson of Thomas Whitmore. He had left the bookshop so abruptly when she had asked about his grandfather, but now Claire needed to press further. If anyone knew what had truly happened to Thomas and Eleanor, it was him, and she was determined to find out. The late afternoon sun bathed Honeywick in a golden glow as Claire walked toward Daniel Whitmore's cottage, the tin box of letters cradled carefully in her hands. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender through the air, weaving through the fields like a whispered secret. The weight of the letters, the history, the love that had been left untold for so many years, pressed upon her, not as a burden, but as something sacred, something waiting to be understood. She found Daniel outside, kneeling in his vegetable garden, hands deep in the earth. He worked in quiet concentration, the kind of stillness that only came from years of knowing the land. For a moment she hesitated. He wasn't a man who invited conversation easily, but this was different. This was his family's story, and it was time for him to know it. Daniel? He turned his head slightly, his deep-set eyes squinting against the afternoon light. Claire. She took a steadying breath. I found something. In the attic, and beneath the old oak tree. His brow furrowed slightly. What do you mean? Wordlessly she held up the tin box. His gaze dropped to it, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't ask what was inside, but there was a shift in him, something unspoken, something deep. I found letters, she said gently. Your grandfather's letters, to Eleanor Hartwood. Daniel exhaled slowly, wiping the soil from his hands before standing. His shoulders were tense, his gaze locked onto the tin as if it held something long buried, not just in the earth, but in time itself. Claire watched him carefully. He came back, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Thomas came back for her. At that, something flickered in Daniel's expression, hope, disbelief, maybe even longing for a past he had never been a part of but had always existed somewhere in his blood. He told her to wait for him at the lavender fields, but she never read the letter. Claire continued, her voice softer now. Do you know what happened? Did they ever see each other again? For a long moment Daniel was silent. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, toward the lavender stretching in endless waves beyond the village, his thoughts lost somewhere between memory and history. And then at last he spoke. Thomas left Honeywick when he was young, he said, his voice measured as though he had only ever been told pieces of this story and had never quite put them together. But his heart never truly did, and when he finally returned, it was as if he had never been gone. Claire felt her breath catch in her chest. "He came back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, glancing at the tin before looking back at her. He did, just as he had promised. He found his way home, to her. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. "She waited," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, "not because she was lost without him, but because she believed in the love they shared, and when he returned, it was as though time had only deepened it." Claire swallowed, her throat tight. They saw each other again? A faint smile touched Daniel's lips, small but real. They did. A rush of relief and joy surged through her, warming her from the inside. The love that had been written in ink, hidden beneath soil and time, had not been lost. It had found its way back. They were older by then, Daniel said, glancing toward the horizon where the lavender met the sky. Their hair had silvered, their hands had known the weight of years, but when they saw each other again, it was as if they had never been apart. Claire could picture it. The way Eleanor must have gasped when she saw him standing there after so many years. The way Thomas must have looked at her, searching for the girl he had left behind, but finding instead the woman he had always loved. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it something almost sacred, as though the very air around them still remembered. They walked through the lavender fields side by side, Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, softer, almost reverent. Neither of them spoke at first. They just existed together. The world had changed, but what they felt, that never did. Claire's heart ached in the best way possible. She could see it so clearly in her mind. Eleanor standing among the lavender, Thomas reaching for her hand, his fingers curling around hers like they had been waiting for a lifetime to do so. They spent the rest of their days together, Daniel finished. Quietly, in the cottage, they never spoke much about the past, about what was lost. They just lived, day by day, grateful for the time they had left. Claire's eyes stung with unshed tears. It was the kind of love story that shouldn't have been possible, the kind that only existed in books and whispered fairy tales. And yet here it was, real, tangible, written not just in ink, but in the very air and soil of Honeywick. She turned toward the Lavender Cottage in the distance, standing strong, holding their story within its walls. "They were happy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. "That's what I've always been told." A deep sense of peace settled over Claire, filling the quiet spaces in her heart. Eleanor had waited. Thomas had returned, and together they had written the ending to their story. A quiet breeze rustled the lavender, carrying its scent through the air. It was as if the land itself had been keeping their love alive, waiting for someone to listen. Claire turned to Daniel, offering him the tin of letters. "These belong to your family." Daniel hesitated, then took the box, holding it carefully. He studied it for a long moment, as though it held more than just letters, as though it held answers he had never known he was looking for. "Thank you, Claire," he said, his voice steadier now. She nodded, knowing that in some way this had been as much his journey as it had been hers. As she walked back toward the Lavender Cottage, the sky painted in the soft hues of dusk, she felt lighter. This place had been waiting for her, just as much as she had been waiting for it. And now, knowing the love story that had once bloomed here, she felt something else. Hope. The evening air in Honeywick carried the scent of lavender and something else. Anticipation. As Claire walked through the village square, she could feel it in the air, humming like a melody just beneath the surface. Tonight was the Lavender Lantern Festival, an annual tradition that had filled the village with warmth and celebration for generations. Golden lanterns hung from every storefront, their soft glow flickering like captured fireflies. The cobblestone streets were alive with laughter and music, children darting between the stalls selling homemade pastries, hand-woven scarves, and delicate trinkets carved from wood. Claire had never experienced anything like it. She had spent most of her life in the city where festivals were grand but impersonal, crowded streets, loud voices, and the constant rush of time slipping away. But here in Honeywick, everything felt different. Slower, more intimate. As if every lantern that swayed in the breeze held a story, a whispered memory of the hands that had lit them before. She pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders as she made her way through the square, pausing near the bakery where the scent of cinnamon and freshly baked scones wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Edith Finch was standing nearby, chattering away with a group of villagers, her silver curls bouncing as she laughed. When she spotted Claire, her eyes lit up. "Well, there you are, dear. I was wondering when you'd come join the fun." Claire smiled. "I've never seen anything like this before. It's beautiful." "Oh, it's one of Honeywick's oldest traditions," Edith said proudly. "Started decades ago, maybe even longer than that. Every year we light lanterns and let them float over the lavender fields. It's a way of remembering those who came before us, of honoring love and time and everything in between." Claire's heart warmed at the sentiment. There was something undeniably magical about it. Before she could reply, a voice behind her spoke. "I see they roped you into the festival." She turned to find Daniel Whitmore, hands in his pockets, his usual quiet presence somehow fitting perfectly into the golden glow of the night. Claire chuckled. "I wouldn't say I was roped in, more like enchanted by it." A small, almost reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It does have that effect." She studied him for a moment. It had only been a few days since their conversation about his grandfather, but something had changed in him since then. He seemed lighter, as though something had settled in his soul. Claire glanced down at his hands. "You're not holding a lantern." Daniel exhaled, looking toward the sky where the first of the lanterns were beginning to rise, floating like tiny stars against the deepening twilight. "I haven't lit one in a long time." She tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Didn't see the point." Claire thought about the letters, the love story he had only just learned in full, about his grandfather returning home after all those years, about how some stories never truly end. They just take a little longer to find their way back where they belong. And then she made a decision. "Come with me." Without waiting for his answer, she gently took his wrist and led him through the square, weaving past the stalls and the murmuring villagers until they reached the lantern station. There, dozens of unlit paper lanterns sat in neat rows, their delicate frames swaying slightly in the night air. She picked one up and handed it to him. "For them." Daniel's fingers closed around the lantern slowly, as though feeling its weight for the first time. He swallowed, his gaze flickering with something unspoken. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right." Claire smiled and picked up a lantern of her own. They walked in silence toward the lavender fields, where the rest of the village had already begun gathering. The sky was darker now, a perfect canvas for the golden lanterns that drifted higher and higher, their soft light reflecting in the eyes of those who watched them go. Claire knelt carefully in the grass, lighting the small candle inside her lantern before standing again, cradling it between her palms. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering something only the wind would hear. A memory of Arthur's hands in hers, the sound of his laughter, the way he had always believed in love, in second chances, in stories yet to be written. When she opened her eyes, the lantern was glowing, ready to take flight. Beside her, Daniel stood, his expression unreadable as he held his own lantern, watching the flame flicker. "For them," Claire reminded him gently, and then, together, they let go. The lanterns drifted upward, joining the others in their slow, graceful ascent. Claire watched as Daniel's gaze followed them, something softening in his features, something that spoke of healing, of closure, of a story finally told the way it was meant to be. The wind carried the lanterns higher and higher until they became nothing more than golden embers against the vast stretch of night. Daniel exhaled, a quiet, steady sound. "Thank you," he murmured. Claire smiled. It's what they would have wanted. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, watching as the lanterns disappeared into the stars. Then finally, Daniel turned to her and said, "Come on. There's a dance in the square, and I believe it's tradition that newcomers have to dance at least once." Claire laughed, caught off guard but utterly delighted. "Is that so?" "That's what I've been told." "Well," she said, taking his offered arm, "I wouldn't want to break tradition." And as they walked back toward the village, toward the music and the laughter and the warm glow of lanterns still rising in the distance, Claire couldn't help but think, some stories find their way back home, no matter how much time has passed. And perhaps, just perhaps, hers was still unfolding. The music of the festival drifted through the air, warm and inviting, as Claire found herself moving through the lantern-lit square with Daniel at her side. The village green had been transformed into a makeshift dance floor, where couples swayed in time to the soft melody of a violin and piano. It was the kind of night that felt almost timeless, as if the very air carried whispers of all the festivals that had come before, folding past and present into one golden moment. Claire hesitated at the edge of the dancing crowd, her fingers brushing the edges of her shawl. It had been years since she had danced, truly danced. Arthur had been the last man to take her hand, to spin her beneath the glow of string lights at some forgotten anniversary party. The thought sent a pang through her, but it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Daniel must have sensed her hesitation because he turned to her with a quiet patience that reminded her, strangely, of Arthur in his younger days. "We don't have to," he said simply, offering her a way out. But something in Claire stirred, a realization. She had spent so long looking back at the love that had filled her years, at the memories carefully wrapped in her heart like delicate keepsakes. But love was never meant to be only something to remember. It was something to live. With a breath of resolve, she smiled up at Daniel. "I think I'd like to dance." His lips twitched in the smallest of smiles as he extended his hand, waiting until she took it before leading her onto the green. The music was gentle, an old tune with a melody that seemed to belong to another era. Claire let herself fall into the rhythm, into the warmth of the moment. Daniel was steady, moving with the quiet ease of someone who had spent more time in the fields than in ballrooms, but he didn't step on her toes, and that was good enough for her. "You've done this before," Claire observed, amused. Daniel shrugged. "My grandmother taught me. She always said a man should know how to waltz, just in case." Claire's heart warmed at the thought of Eleanor, teaching a younger Daniel the steps to an old-fashioned dance. She was a wise woman. "She was," he agreed, his expression unreadable for a moment before he added, "She would have liked you." Claire blinked, caught off guard by the quiet weight of his words. "She would have liked you." It was a simple sentiment, but it held more meaning than she could name, a kind of unspoken welcome, a bridge between past and present. The song changed, shifting into something livelier, and around them villagers clapped and laughed as the dance quickened. Claire was about to step back to excuse herself, but Daniel tightened his grip ever so slightly. "One more?" She exhaled a soft laugh. "All right." And just like that, the moment stretched into something longer, something lighter, as the weight of the past gave way to the joy of the present. When the music finally slowed, Claire stepped away, her breath unsteady, but her heart light. Around them, the festival continued. Lanterns still drifting into the sky, laughter curling through the air like smoke from the bakery's warm ovens. Daniel led her back to the edge of the green, and they stood for a moment, watching the village hum with life. "You know," Claire said after a pause, "I used to think stories were only meant for books." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the Lavender Cottage in the distance, its windows glowing faintly in the night. "I came here thinking my story had already been written, that I was just here to turn the pages and let it settle. But now, I think, maybe I'm still in the middle of it." Daniel was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My grandmother used to say the best stories don't have endings. They just become part of something bigger." Claire felt the truth of that settle inside her, warm and steady. Perhaps that was what Eleanor and Thomas had known too. That love, in all its forms, never truly ended. It lived on, in memories, in whispered promises, in the people who carried it forward in small, quiet ways. As if sensing her thoughts, Daniel turned slightly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Do you still have her journal?" Claire nodded. "Yes." "Then maybe we should finish reading it." Her breath hitched slightly at the thought. There were still pages left unread, still pieces of Eleanor's life that had yet to be uncovered, and maybe, just maybe, there was something left for them to find, a story waiting to be told. Claire smiled, feeling the lavender-scented breeze wrap around her like an old friend. "I think I'd like that." And as the village lights flickered and the last of the lanterns disappeared into the sky, Claire realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just remembering the past, she was stepping into the future. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of the Lavender Cottage, filling the cozy space with a golden glow. Claire stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the lavender sway gently in the breeze. The past few weeks had unfolded in ways she never expected, unraveling a love story that had endured the test of time and finding herself woven into the fabric of Honeywick in ways she hadn't imagined. The village no longer felt like a place she had come to escape to. It felt like a place she belonged. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Setting down her tea, she opened it to find Daniel standing there, holding a small wooden box. "Morning," he said, his voice steady as always, but there was something different in his expression today. Something lighter. "Good morning," Claire said with a small smile, stepping aside to let him in. "Tea?" He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Sure." As she moved to the kettle, she watched him out of the corner of her eye. He placed the wooden box on the table, his fingers lingering on the lid as though it held something precious. "What's that?" she asked, pouring his tea. He exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the grain of the wood. "I thought you might like to see this." Curious, Claire set his cup down and took a seat across from him. Daniel carefully lifted the lid, revealing a stack of old photographs. Claire's breath caught as he picked up the first one and handed it to her. It was a black and white image of a young woman standing in a lavender field, the wind teasing at the hem of her dress. Eleanor. She looked radiant, her eyes full of life, her smile soft but certain. "She looks just like I imagined her," Claire murmured, running her fingers lightly over the aged photograph. Daniel passed her another, a picture of a man standing beside Eleanor, his hand resting gently on her lower back. "Thomas." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. He was older than she had pictured him from the letters, but the love in his eyes was unmistakable. "They stayed here," Daniel said quietly, his voice almost reverent. "They lived out their years together. My grandmother used to tell me stories, but I never really listened. I didn't understand then how much it mattered." Claire smiled softly. "But you do now." Daniel nodded, sifting through more photographs, some of Eleanor and Thomas sitting outside the Lavender Cottage, some of them in the village square, others of them simply existing together, hand in hand, side by side. She could almost hear their laughter in the rustling leaves outside, in the creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. They had lived. And they had loved. Daniel finally placed one last photograph in front of her. It was a picture of Eleanor standing beside a small boy, his dark hair tousled by the wind, his hands tucked into his pockets. Claire looked up at him, realization dawning. "That's your father, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. She was a part of his life, even after Thomas passed. She never stopped telling stories about him, about how he came back, about how love lasts. Claire swallowed past the warmth swelling in her chest. They weren't just memories to her, she said softly. They were part of her. Always. Daniel exhaled, sitting back slightly in his chair. Yeah. He looked at her then, really looked at her. I guess I never realized that stories like theirs don't just belong to the past. They shape the people who come after them. Claire nodded slowly, letting the words settle deep. There was something about knowing where you come from, knowing the love that built the very ground you stand on. And maybe, just maybe, she was still building something of her own. After a long pause, Daniel gestured toward the journal on the table. And what about you, Claire? She blinked. What about me? His expression was unreadable. You came here looking for a fresh start. Do you think you found it? Claire hesitated, but then something inside her settled. I think I stopped looking. Daniel tilted his head slightly. I mean, she continued, a small smile forming, I think I was searching for something when I arrived. A reason to still move forward, a way to fill the quiet spaces in my life. But now, I don't feel like I have to look for anything anymore. She glanced out the window, watching the lavender dance in the wind. I think I've already found it. For the first time, Daniel's smile wasn't small or reserved. It was real. Genuine. Good, he said simply. Claire let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as she reached for another photograph. Maybe she wasn't just uncovering Eleanor's story. Maybe she was writing her own. A story of second chances, of belonging, of love in all the ways it chooses to stay. And somehow she knew this was only the beginning. The air was thick with the scent of lavender as Claire stepped out onto the porch, the morning sun casting golden streaks across the rolling fields. A sense of quiet contentment had settled deep within her, as if the land itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for so long. She ran her fingers along the worn wooden railing, gazing out at the world she had come to love. Honeywick, with its cobbled streets and warm-hearted people, had not just been a place to escape to, it had become home. A gentle knock at the door drew her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Daniel standing there, a familiar tin box in his hands. I thought you might want this back, he said. Claire looked at the box, then back at him. It belongs to your family. Daniel hesitated before shaking his head. It belongs to the cottage, to the story. She took the box from him carefully, feeling the weight of history inside. With a smile, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. As they sat at the kitchen table, Claire carefully lifted the lid, her eyes scanning the delicate sheets of parchment. The letters, the memories, they were no longer just remnants of the past. They were a bridge, a thread connecting those who had come before to those who remained. Daniel glanced around the cottage, his gaze thoughtful. Do you ever wonder why you ended up here, Claire? She exhaled softly. All the time, he nodded. Maybe it wasn't just coincidence. Claire smiled, brushing her fingers over the journal's worn leather cover. No, I don't think it was. Something about the way life had unfolded, the way she had found this place, found Eleanor's story, and in turn found herself, felt too meaningful to be accidental. Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking at her with quiet curiosity. And now? She met his gaze, knowing exactly what he meant. What happens now? Claire turned toward the window, watching as the lavender fields danced in the breeze. This cottage isn't just a house, it's a story, a sanctuary, a place where love has lingered for generations. I don't want to just pass through its history. I want to be part of it. I've spent my life looking back, holding on to memories, but now I choose to stay, to live, to plant my own roots in this soil and let whatever comes next unfold right here, in the Lavender Cottage. She paused, her heart steady, her decision clear. Arthur always wanted me to be happy, to embrace life fully, and so that's what I'm going to do. I'll start this new chapter and see where it takes me. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then smiled, one of the rare, genuine ones that softened the quiet edges of his usual demeanor. Good. It was a simple word, but it carried weight. She belonged here, and she had chosen to stay. Claire rose from the table, walking toward the fireplace where she had placed Eleanor's journal on the mantel. As she set the tin box beside it, something caught her eye, a small, carved indentation just beneath the wood. Frowning, she ran her fingers over it, feeling the uneven grooves. "What is it?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. Claire tilted her head, squinting at the markings. And then, as the light hit just right, she saw it. Initials. E-H and T-W. Her breath caught. "They were here," she whispered. "Together." Daniel ran his fingers over the carving, a quiet reverence in his expression. "They left their mark." Claire smiled, pressing her palm against the initials. A love story, etched into the very bones of the cottage. She turned to Daniel. "Would you help me fix up the garden?" He blinked at the sudden change in conversation, but then a knowing look crossed his face. "You mean the overgrown mess you call a garden?" Claire laughed, nudging him playfully. "Exactly." Daniel shook his head but nodded. "Yeah, I think I can do that." And just like that, a new chapter began. Claire took one last look at the initials before stepping away, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, woven into the walls, whispered in the lavender-scented air, carried in the memories of those who chose to remember. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of another. And for the first time in a long time, Claire Hastings knew. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Some stories linger, like the scent of lavender in the breeze, or a melody that stays long after the last note fades. The Lavender Cottage is more than a tale. It's a reminder that love endures, memories find their way home, and new beginnings are always waiting. If this story touched your heart, consider liking, sharing it with loved ones, and subscribing for more journeys like this. Because some endings are only the beginning, with warmth and gratitude. Good night and sweet dreams from Story Planet.